The chandeliers glittered like 1,000 captured stars, suspended above the hall of the Lagos Grand Marriott, where the wealthiest and most powerful figures in Nigerian high society had gathered. Tonight was not just a gala, it was a showcase of dominance, an exhibition of wealth and influence that only the likes of Chikeobi Nwokorie could orchestrate. At 42, the black Nigerian billionaire carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed the world itself bowed at his command. His trousers were perfectly tailored, hugging his tall, commanding frame, while his dark blazer shimmered faintly under the ballroom lights, exuding authority and precision. Every gesture he made was calculated, from the slight tilt of his chin to the confident smirk that lingered on his lips. Men envied him, women admired him, and his name was whispered in business circles as the man who could turn dust into gold. Yet, amidst the opulence of the evening, there was a tension that few could put their fingers on. His wife, Amarachi Nwokorie, stood gracefully at his side, her gown a deep shade of emerald that seemed to draw light to her radiant skin. Her features were unmistakably Nigerian high cheekbones, full lips, a regal nose that carried heritage and beauty with equal weight. She exuded elegance, though her smile appeared a touch too practiced, her laughter a shade too restrained. For years, she had perfected the art of standing silently beside her husband, a vision of loyalty and grace, even as the shadows of his arrogance loomed larger with each passing year. The gala reached its height when Chikeobi took the stage, microphone in hand, commanding silence from the crowd with the simple raise of his palm. Guests, a sea of business tycoons, politicians, and celebrities, leaned forward eagerly. They expected a grand announcement, perhaps another business expansion, or a charitable endowment to further inflate his image of benevolence. Instead, what they received was a performance so cold, so callous, that the very air in the hall seemed to freeze. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chikeobi began, his voice smooth, confident, laced with the authority of a man who owned not only the stage but the people watching him. "I stand before you tonight, not only as a man of business but as a man of clarity and truth. Too often, we men in positions of power allow sentiment to cloud our judgment. Tonight, I refuse to be a victim of such weakness." A murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion etched on their faces. Amarachi, standing elegantly at the foot of the stage, shifted ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing but her composure unbroken. She knew her husband's love for theatrics, but something in his tone carried a weight she had never heard before. Chikeobi's next words sliced through the room like sharpened steel. "Amarachi Nwokorie," he declared, pointing directly at his wife, his tone devoid of affection. "From this moment forward, I release myself from the bonds of our marriage. I divorce you, here, now, before witnesses of substance, so that no one may ever question where I stand." The hall gasped in unison, a sound of collective shock as fans whirred above, circulating the tension. Guests turned, eyes darting between the billionaire and his wife, searching for signs that this was some elaborate jest. But Chikeobi's eyes bore into Amarachi with chilling finality, and there was no humor in them, only arrogance. Amarachi's hand twitched against her gown, but her face remained unnervingly still. Her lips parted slightly as if to respond, but she quickly closed them again. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, her back elongating, her dignity unshaken, though her heart pounded violently in her chest. She would not give him the satisfaction of watching her shatter. Whispers erupted among the guests. Did he just divorce her in public? My God, the audacity. Poor woman. Their murmurs swelled like waves, crashing against her composure. But Amarachi stood as though their words could not reach her. Her eyes, dark and deep, remained locked on Chikeobi, not with pleading or despair, but with an unreadable calm. Inside her, however, the memories bled fresh, nights when she sat awake, poring over his early financial proposals, correcting his errors, refining his strategies while he slept. Days when she had pawned her own jewelry to fund his first business venture. Years when her dreams of becoming a corporate leader in her own right had been set aside so his could thrive. She had believed in him when no one else had. She had been the quiet architect of his empire, though the world never knew it. But now, as she stood in the spotlight of humiliation, she saw clearly what had taken root in her husband's heart. Success had not sharpened his love but had instead corroded it, transforming him into a man who saw loyalty as weakness, compassion as a flaw. His ego had become his god, and she, his wife, his partner, was now disposable in his kingdom of glass. Chikeobi, satisfied with the spectacle, handed the microphone to the master of ceremonies and stepped down from the stage, brushing past Amarachi as if she were a stranger. The crowd parted before him, their silence heavy with disapproval, though no one dared confront him directly. Amarachi stood alone, their gazes piercing her like daggers, some pitying, some judgmental, others secretly thrilled at the drama unfolding before them. And yet, even in the depths of her betrayal, Amarachi's strength began to gleam faintly, like embers refusing to die out. She tilted her chin upward, her posture regal, her presence unbroken. For the first time that night, her lips curved into a small, controlled smile, an expression so subtle, so enigmatic, that it unsettled even those who pitied her. Without a word, she turned and began walking slowly toward the grand doors of the hall, the emerald fabric of her gown trailing behind her like a river of defiance. Each step she took carried a silent declaration. She was not defeated. She was not broken. Her silence screamed louder than any outburst could. The whispers intensified as she passed. She's smiling? Why is she smiling? What does she know? Guests exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something far greater had been set into motion, though none could guess what it was. And as Amarachi pushed open the heavy doors, her unreadable smile lingering like a secret weapon, the thought reverberated in the minds of everyone present. Could she be plotting something far beyond revenge? The night after the public betrayal, the city of Lagos buzzed with scandal. Socialites whispered in lounges, tabloids ran lurid headlines, and television anchors dissected every detail of the divorce spectacle at the gala. To the outside world, Amarachi Nwokorie was the humiliated wife cast aside by her billionaire husband. The image of her standing frozen beneath the glittering chandeliers, while Chikeobi declared their marriage over, had already become the symbol of her supposed downfall. Yet behind closed doors, inside the quiet expanse of her private residence, Amarachi sat at her desk with an expression far from defeated. Instead of grief, her eyes glowed with the sharp focus of a strategist who had been waiting for this very moment. Before she was Mrs. Nwokorie, Amarachi had been Amarachi Chisom, an ambitious, brilliant young woman whose mind for numbers and strategies once made her the most promising graduate of her business school. Professors had called her a queen of foresight, a woman who could spot flaws in a business plan as easily as most spotted spelling mistakes. She had dreamed of building her own empire, of leading multinational corporations, and redefining what it meant for a Nigerian woman to wield power on a global scale. But when she met Chikeobi in her early 20s, his charm had been undeniable. He was ambitious too, but raw, reckless, and hungry in ways that made him seem unstoppable. Amarachi had seen not only the man but the potential in him, and she had chosen to tether her brilliance to his ambition. Love blinded her at first, and then loyalty carried her through years of sacrifice. Her career became his career. Her dreams melted into the blueprint of his empire. She gave up her rising opportunities, instead pouring her energy into shaping his destiny. Late into countless nights, when Chikeobi slept after grand speeches and long negotiations, Amarachi sat at the dining table with financial statements spread out before her, red pen in hand. She corrected errors, highlighted risks, and created solutions that he would later present as his own. She studied alliances, warned him about partners who might betray him, and suggested strategies that saved his ventures from ruin more than once. To the world, he was the genius billionaire who always made the right move, but Amarachi knew the truth. Many of those right moves had come from her sleepless nights and her uncredited brilliance. Over the years, Amarachi had also built a mental map of Chikeobi's empire that no outsider could dream of possessing. She knew the fragile partnerships hidden beneath polished contracts. She knew which executives secretly disliked him, which alliances were held together only by money and fear. She knew the flaws in his expansion strategy, the over-leveraged projects he had ignored, and the quiet discontent simmering among his board members. Amarachi had been the invisible pillar of his empire, and now, stripped of her title as his wife, she was free to decide whether to use that knowledge or let it rot. In the dim glow of her study lamp, Amarachi's phone buzzed. The name flashing across the screen was one that filled her with warmth: Ngozi Udena. Ngozi had been her childhood friend, the one who had always cheered her independence, even when Amarachi had chosen marriage over her career. Ngozi was blunt, fiery, and unafraid of truths that hurt. Amarachi answered the call, and before she could even say hello, Ngozi's voice spilled through the speaker. "Amara, the whole city is talking. They're painting you as some poor woman discarded like trash. I know you, my sister. You're not sitting there crying." Amarachi chuckled softly, her tone calm. "They think I am broken, Ngozi. Let them think so. Sometimes the greatest weapon is being underestimated." "You mean to tell me you saw this coming?" Ngozi asked, incredulous. "I knew the man I married," Amarachi replied, her gaze drifting to the window where Lagos lights shimmered like restless stars. Arrogance never stays content. Power always demands more. I didn't know the night or the place, but I knew eventually he would choose his ego over me. I was prepared. And what now? Revenge? Ngozi pressed. Amarachi shook her head, even though her friend couldn't see her. Not revenge. Empowerment. If I strike at him with hate, I become like him. But if I rise with purpose, I will become untouchable. He will destroy himself trying to understand how I got there. Ngozi was silent for a moment, then exhaled sharply. Then, whatever you're planning, Amara, make it big enough to shake the ground he stands on. A faint smile tugged at Amarachi's lips. She picked up a notepad from her desk and with steady hands began mapping out the skeleton of her new life. No longer hidden behind her husband's shadow, she would build something that bore her name alone. She wrote not of vengeance, but of power, influence, and independence. This was not about reclaiming dignity, it was about crafting an empire that would stand as a testament to her brilliance. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. And so, as the hours slipped past midnight, she reached out to a contact she had not spoken to in years. The number was one Chikeobi had never known existed. Her fingers hovered for a second before pressing dial. Her heart steady, her decision absolute. On the other end of the line, when a deep voice finally answered with recognition, Amarachi's lips curved into a quiet, knowing smile. "It's been a long time," she said softly, "but I think the moment has finally come." Meanwhile, across the city, Chikeobi basked in his newfound freedom. He attended exclusive dinners, surrounded himself with women eager to be linked to his wealth, and relished the media frenzy that painted him as bold, decisive, and untethered. He dismissed Amarachi from his thoughts as one dismisses a finished chapter in a book, convinced she would fade into irrelevance without his name to carry her. His arrogance blinded him to the storm already gathering beyond his sight. The press feasted on the scandal, flooding social media and television with endless commentary. The billionaire discards his queen. Amarachi Nwokorie, humiliated wife, disappears from public view. Analysts speculated about how much of his fortune she would receive in divorce settlements, while others pitied her as yet another woman sacrificed on the altar of male ego. To them, Amarachi was merely the tragic figure in Chikeobi's grand narrative. But within the walls of her study, Amarachi scrolled through the headlines with an amused smile. Her eyes glinted with secrets the world could not imagine. Let them think she was humiliated. Let them think she was silent. Soon, they would realize silence was not weakness, but strategy. And as she closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, the thought pulsed through her veins like electricity. What could she possibly unleash that would shake Chikeobi's empire? The world expected Amarachi to retreat into silence after the scandal, to vanish behind gilded gates with whatever settlement Chikeobi offered her. Society often assumed that women humiliated in public would lick their wounds in private, living in the shadows of the men who discarded them. But Amarachi Nwokorie was not built for shadows. Beneath the stillness of her smile that night at the gala, a storm had been gathering, and now, step by step, it began to break free. Within weeks of the divorce announcement, whispers began circulating in business circles. A name once tied exclusively to Chikeobi's success had resurfaced: Amarachi, not as a fallen wife, but as a leader stepping into the spotlight. The first shock came when documents revealed her newly registered company, Ziora Capital, a firm that promised not only to invest in rising industries but to restructure the way business alliances were built in Nigeria. It was a bold move, audacious even, for a woman whom many had written off, and yet the careful precision in the firm's objectives made industry analysts sit up straighter. This was no vanity project. This was war. Ngozi, loyal and relentless, had been Amarachi's anchor in those early days. She introduced Amarachi to the right networks, whispered the right names, and eventually arranged a discreet meeting with a man whose reputation was both admired and feared: Obinna Akadike. Known for his ruthless business instincts, Obinna was a Nigerian black billionaire whose empire rivaled Chikeobi's in size and reach. Tall, broad-shouldered, and perpetually dressed in blazers that accentuated his commanding presence, he was a man who played chess with people's lives and often won. His smile could charm, but his eyes revealed little, sharp, calculating, and always searching for the weakness in others. When Amarachi first sat across from him in a private lounge overlooking Victoria Island, she noticed the way his gaze lingered not in lust, but in assessment. He was weighing her, testing whether she was merely an angry wife seeking relevance or a force worth aligning with. Amarachi met his gaze evenly, her emerald dress replaced now by a sharply tailored black trouser suit. "I am not here to be rescued, Mr. Akadike," she said coolly. "I am here to build, and I want an ally who understands power, not pity." Obinna's lips curled into a faint smile. "You speak like someone who knows more than the headlines tell us." "Very well, Mrs." He paused deliberately before correcting himself. "Miss Nwokorie, let us see what empire you are capable of creating." Meanwhile, across the city, Chikeobi scoffed when the news reached him. He dismissed Amarachi's new venture as a desperate attempt for relevance. "She will fail," he told his executives, his voice dripping with disdain. "Without me, she is nothing. The world knows it." His arrogance blinded him, convincing him that Amarachi's brilliance had always been his to control. He could not imagine her standing on her own, much less thriving. But when Ziora Capital launched publicly, the shockwaves it sent through the financial world were impossible to ignore. Amarachi unveiled a groundbreaking partnership with mid-level enterprises that Chikeobi's empire had overlooked. She tapped into emerging sectors, technology startups, renewable energy projects, and logistics firms, and gave them funding with innovative structures that not only supported them, but bound them to her firm with loyalty and trust. She spoke at her launch with calm authority, every word calculated, her poise radiating both intellect and strength. The media, once pitying her as a humiliated wife, shifted their attention. Headlines now read, "From betrayal to boardroom, Amarachi Nwokorie's stunning reinvention, and the woman who refuses to fade." The narrative had flipped, and for the first time, her name was not tethered to Chikeobi's but stood boldly on its own. And then came the defections. One by one, key employees from Chikeobi's empire resigned, their letters carefully worded but their actions loud. Some joined Amarachi openly, while others acted as quiet informants, feeding her insights into the weaknesses of his operations. For years, they had respected her intellect, but had been bound by loyalty or fear of Chikeobi. Now, freed by his arrogance and inspired by her rise, they gravitated toward the leader who had always deserved recognition. Chikeobi felt the sting. In board meetings, executives avoided his eyes, their loyalty crumbling as they compared his declining charisma to Amarachi's rising star. His once unshakable confidence grew brittle when he mocked her at another gala, calling her venture a charity project disguised as business. The press condemned him for pettiness, contrasting his arrogance with her quiet grace. For the first time in years, Chikeobi was not the story Amarachi was. Amarachi's first major victory came when Ziora Capital outmaneuvered Chikeobi's company in securing a lucrative government-backed energy contract. The news stunned elite circles. That she could win against her ex-husband so soon after their divorce was not just surprising, it was seismic. Investors whispered about her sharp instincts, journalists marveled at her resilience, and socialites who once pitied her now begged for invitations to her events. She had become the symbol of dignity reborn, of strength carved from betrayal. Yet in the midst of her triumph, Amarachi noticed Obinna's smile. It was warm enough to comfort, steady enough to reassure, but behind it lingered something else, a flicker of satisfaction too sharp to be simple pride in her success. He congratulated her with a toast, his words smooth and measured. "You are everything I expected, Amarachi. And, perhaps, more dangerous than even you realize." His tone unsettled her. It was a compliment, but laced with an edge, as though he saw layers of the game she had yet to uncover. Amarachi brushed off the unease, convincing herself it was nothing more than the guarded manner of a powerful man. But as the champagne flutes clinked and the cameras flashed around them, she felt a faint chill crawl down her spine. For in her rise, Amarachi had gained allies, power, and a new identity. But she had also stepped into the dangerous world of Obinna Akadike, a man who never moved a piece on the chessboard without envisioning the checkmate. And as the night ended, the thought hung over her like an unspoken warning. Was she aligning herself with a new enemy in disguise? For years, Chikeobi Nwokorie had lived with the illusion that his empire was untouchable, a fortress built on brilliance and strength. But now, as dawn broke over Lagos and his financial reports spread across the mahogany table in his penthouse office, the illusion began to falter. Numbers that once reflected endless growth now revealed troubling inconsistencies. Investments that were once profitable bled silently in red. Loans that had always been refinanced with ease now faced hesitation from banks. Something in the current of his empire had shifted, and though his arrogance fought to deny it, Chikeobi knew the truth. Instability was seeping in. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Partners who once called him visionary now delayed returning his calls. Deals that should have closed within days dragged on for weeks, excuses piling up like bricks in a wall. There were whispers in elite circles, faint but persistent, suggesting that his reign was not as secure as it appeared, and those whispers carried a name on their breath: Amarachi. At first, he laughed when he heard it. He mocked the idea that Amarachi, his former wife, the woman he had dismissed as a decorative shadow, could be the cause of his troubles. At one press event, when a journalist asked about her new company, Chikeobi smirked into the cameras. Ziora Capital? That is not a company, it's a hobby. Amarachi is like a child with building blocks, amusing to watch, but hardly threatening. His laughter rang across the room, confident and condescending, but instead of diminishing her, his mockery backfired spectacularly. The media turned his words into headlines of arrogance. Billionaire mocks ex-wife's success. Is Chikeobi afraid of Amarachi? Suddenly, the comparison between the two became unavoidable. She, dignified and strategic. He, dismissive and blinded by ego. His board members noticed the contrast too. Once loyal men and women, they began exchanging uneasy glances during meetings. They questioned his impulsive spending, his erratic leadership, and his obsession with diminishing Amarachi rather than focusing on stabilizing the empire. When he dismissed their concerns with arrogance, their silence grew colder, their patience thinner. The tension came to a head one morning when Chikeobi erupted in fury during a board session. "You think she is smarter than me?" he thundered, slamming his palm against the polished table. "I built this empire with my blood. Amarachi is nothing without me." His words echoed across the room, but instead of reassurance, he found only lowered eyes and pursed lips. Even his closest allies seemed weary of his rage. In his paranoia, he began lashing out at trusted executives, accusing them of disloyalty. Contracts were torn apart, meetings dissolved in anger, and long-serving allies were cast out without hesitation. The isolation that followed was self-inflicted, but Chikeobi refused to see it. His arrogance would not allow him to admit weakness. Meanwhile, Amarachi moved with precision. From the quiet sanctum of Ziora Capital, she watched her former husband stumble like a titan too proud to notice the cracks beneath his feet. She struck not with noise but with silence, her moves invisible until they were irreversible. Her greatest coup came when she successfully poached Kenechukwu Ajaero, one of Chikeobi's most trusted advisors. Kenechukwu had been at Chikeobi's side for years, privy to the inner workings of his empire. A tall man with sharp features and a reputation for loyalty, he had long been the strategist Chikeobi trusted most. But beneath, his loyalty simmered frustration. Frustration at being ignored, at watching Chikeobi discard wisdom for arrogance. Amarachi saw this fracture and approached with quiet respect. When Kenechukwu finally walked into Ziora Capital's offices, Amarachi extended her hand with a calm smile. "I do not want to destroy him," she said softly, "but I will not let him destroy me. With your knowledge and my vision, we can build something he never imagined possible." Kenechukwu hesitated, torn between history and possibility. But in the end, he chose the leader who listened, who valued intellect over ego. His defection shook Chikeobi's empire to its core. For the first time, Chikeobi realized that loyalty could not be commanded by wealth, it had to be earned, and he had failed to earn it. The media devoured the drama. Articles praised Amarachi's brilliance in recruiting such a vital strategist. Commentators lauded her as a rising phoenix, a woman who had transformed public humiliation into triumph. In contrast, Chikeobi became the face of decline, his arrogance mocked in headlines, his temper dissected on talk shows. The world loved a story of downfall, and Chikeobi had unknowingly cast himself as its protagonist. Yet even as Amarachi savored her victories, a shadow slipped across her desk one evening. An envelope arrived, delivered by an anonymous courier. No return address, no indication of its sender. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words typed in bold: "Be careful with Obinna Akadike. His interest in you is not what it seems." The letter was unsigned, but it sent a chill through her veins. She folded it neatly, hiding it in her drawer, her expression unreadable. Was this a ploy to sow distrust, or a genuine warning? She could not yet decide, but her instincts whispered caution. Meanwhile, Chikeobi spiraled deeper into desperation. His fortune remained vast, but he felt it slipping like sand through his fingers. Nights found him pacing the floors of his penthouse, blazer unbuttoned, tie discarded, muttering to himself. In his mind, Amarachi was no longer his ex-wife. She was an adversary, an enemy threatening to undo everything he had built. "I will crush her," he vowed in the darkness, fists clenched. "I will remind her who I am." His pride refused to acknowledge that his empire was already trembling. Every move he made to assert dominance only pushed him closer to collapse. And as the city hummed with rumors, as Amarachi tightened her grip on rising power, and as Obinna's smile grew sharper in the shadows, one question loomed over them all. Could Chikeobi's empire be closer to collapse than he dared to admit? The glow of Amarachi's rising empire filled the headlines, and her name was spoken in circles where once she had only been the invisible wife behind Chikeobi. Yet as her influence grew, so too did the presence of a man whose shadow was both alluring and dangerous, Obinna Akadike. At first, he had entered quietly, a benefactor offering resources and access that seemed like golden doors opening at just the right time. But as weeks turned into months, his involvement deepened, weaving itself into the very fabric of Ziora capital. Obinna poured vast amounts of capital into her projects, securing international partners, and lending her company a credibility that silenced even the harshest skeptics. With his backing, Ziora capital expanded faster than even Amarachi had anticipated. Technology firms clamored for her attention, renewable energy startups sought her counsel, and logistics companies bent their strategies to align with her vision. In the boardroom, Obinna sat like a kingmaker, his blazer crisp, his posture unyielding, and his eyes always on Amarachi, as if measuring how far she would climb. But with his generosity came something else, an interest that extended beyond the professional. At first, Amarachi dismissed it as harmless observation, but slowly, she noticed patterns. His gaze lingered a second too long when she spoke, his compliments often veiled as business remarks but tinged with something more. At dinners, he asked questions about her life that strayed from balance sheets and forecasts. "Do you miss the quiet life, Amarachi?" he asked once, his tone heavy with implication. She responded with a polite smile, steering the conversation back to business. But in the stillness of night, she replayed his words with unease. It was Ngozi Udenna who voiced the concern Amarachi tried to bury. Over steaming bowls of pepper soup one evening, Ngozi leaned in with sharp eyes. "Amara, I've watched Obinna. He doesn't see you as just a partner, he sees you as something to own. Be careful. Men like him don't give without expecting to take more in return." Amarachi laughed softly, shaking her head. "Ngozi, I've dealt with arrogance before. I know his type, but this time, I'm in control. I've learned too much to let anyone play me again. Control is an illusion when the man across from you has already planned 3 steps ahead," Ngozi warned, her voice steady. "Remember that." Amarachi listened, but inside she dismissed the warning. She believed she was untouchable now. After all, she had risen from humiliation to triumph. She had stared down Chikeobi's arrogance and won. Surely, she could handle Obinna. But while Amarachi underestimated the depth of Obinna's game, Chikeobi himself was plotting from another angle. Desperate to regain control of his crumbling empire, he reached out discreetly to Obinna, not realizing the man was already Amarachi's ally. The meeting was arranged in secrecy, held in a dimly lit lounge where Chikeobi, dressed sharply but with eyes clouded by desperation, leaned across the table. "You and I both know Amarachi is playing above her league," Chikeobi said with forced confidence. "She can't hold this momentum without me. If you're smart, you'll back out now, and I'll ensure we both win." Obinna listened in silence, his face unreadable. Then, with a faint smirk, he replied, "You underestimate her, Chikeobi, but more importantly, you underestimate me." He left Chikeobi at the table, humiliated and burning with questions he could not answer. Back at Ziora capital, Amarachi began to notice something troubling. Financial reports that once ran smoothly now contained irregularities, small discrepancies at first, numbers that didn't add up, investments shifted in directions she hadn't approved. She confronted her accountants, but they insisted everything was legitimate. Still, her instincts screamed otherwise. One late night, Amarachi pored over files alone in her office. Hours passed as she traced numbers, followed transactions, and finally uncovered a shocking truth. Obinna's capital wasn't free. Hidden clauses in investment agreements tied Ziora Capital's assets directly to Obinna's holding companies. In essence, her empire was being woven into his, thread by thread, until independence would become nothing more than a memory. The realization struck like ice in her veins. She, who had prided herself on foresight, who had vowed never to be blindsided again, had walked willingly into a carefully constructed trap. She sat frozen at her desk, the papers spread before her like a betrayal unfolding in black ink. For the first time since her rise, Amarachi felt doubt gnawing at her. Meanwhile, across Lagos, Chikeobi found himself celebrating. Rumors of Amarachi's financial entanglements reached his ears, and he rejoiced in what he believed was her unraveling. At a dinner with his remaining allies, he raised his glass high. "You see, she was never meant for this world. Without me, she cannot survive. Soon, the empire she thinks she has will crumble, and I will still be standing." His laughter filled the room, arrogant and careless, even as cracks spread beneath his own empire. But in the shadows, Obinna's smirk widened. He played his role flawlessly, supportive partner, generous investor, silent ally while quietly tightening the noose. Every move Amarachi made, he matched with a hidden clause. Every victory she claimed, he claimed too, invisible but binding. His patience was that of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And as Amarachi stared at the damning papers before her, the question clawed at her heart. Could it be that she had walked straight into a trap, one more dangerous than Chikeobi could ever have devised? The first proof came quietly, slipped beneath Amarachi's office door in an unmarked envelope. She found it late in the evening, after her staff had gone home, the only light in her office coming from the tall lamp that cast shadows across the walls. She picked up the envelope with caution, her instincts already bracing her for whatever truth it might hold. Inside was a stack of documents, financial ledgers, contracts, and hidden communications bearing one undeniable revelation. Obinna Akadike was siphoning off Ziora Capital's intellectual property, piece by piece, into his own holding companies. Her heart hammered as she skimmed through the details. Patents registered under subsidiaries she hadn't approved, proprietary algorithms transferred into accounts with Obinna's fingerprints, licensing deals diverted without her consent. It was not speculation, it was fact, and it was brutal. Obinna had been grooming her company not to stand beside his empire, but to fold into it, ensuring that everything she built became his. Amarachi clenched the documents in her hands, her jaw tightening. Betrayal burned hot in her chest, not only because of what Obinna had done, but because she had let herself believe even for a moment that he might be different from Chikeobi. She had told herself she was in control, that she could not be played. And yet, here she stood, staring at proof that her empire had been entangled in a snare. The following morning, she called Ngozi to her private residence. The moment Ngozi read the documents, her reaction was explosive. She slammed the papers onto the table and pointed at Amarachi with fury in her eyes. "I told you, Amara," Ngozi snapped. "I warned you that man doesn't give without taking. He's not an ally, he's a predator. You need to cut him off. Today, right now." Amarachi's voice was calm, almost too calm, but her eyes glimmered with steel. "If I cut ties abruptly, Ngozi, he will destroy everything I've built. He's too powerful to confront recklessly. I need him to believe I am still under his thumb, even while I remove his grip, thread by thread." Ngozi shook her head in frustration. "You're playing with fire. Men like Obinna don't forgive betrayal." "Then let him burn," Amarachi whispered. "But not before I light the match." From that moment, Amarachi shifted her strategy. In boardrooms, she smiled at Obinna, thanked him for his guidance, and agreed with his suggestions. She played the part of the grateful protégé, nodding politely as he made decisions he believed she supported. But in the shadows, she began dismantling his influence, altering contracts, rerouting funds, and creating barriers that slowed his siphoning without alerting him. It was a delicate game of deception, one she could not afford to lose. Meanwhile, Chikeobi reveled in the news that Amarachi's company faced hidden struggles. Though he did not know the details, rumors had reached him that Ziora Capital was entangled in complications. He gloated to anyone who would listen, sneering in interviews and telling his allies, "You see, she thought she could rise without me. But now she falls, just as I knew she would." His arrogance blinded him to the truth that the same Obinna he sought to partner with was quietly using him as well. But Amarachi refused to be blind. Determined to understand the full scale of Obinna's schemes, she set up a covert team, a handful of trusted allies led by none other than Kenechukwu Ajaero. Together, they began digging into Obinna's past, tracing his empire through decades of deals and betrayals. What they uncovered was staggering. Obinna's fortune had been built not on innovation or brilliance, but on exploitation. Vulnerable partners, struggling entrepreneurs, and even rival billionaires had once aligned with him, only to have their companies hollowed out and absorbed. He presented himself as a savior, but behind closed doors, he was a scavenger, feeding on weakness until nothing remained but the shell of what he consumed. Amarachi sat in silence as Kenechukwu laid out the findings, the weight of it pressed against her chest, threatening to break her composure. But instead of fear, her heart filled with something fiercer, a determination carved out of fire. "He thinks I am his next prey," she said softly. "But he forgets I have lived with predators before. And I learned." The revelation shook her, but it did not crush her. If anything, it sharpened her resolve. Amarachi knew she could not rely solely on allies, not even Nosy or Kenechukwu. The battle ahead was one she would have to fight largely alone, for Obinna's reach was wide and his methods ruthless. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. At night, lying awake in the silence of her room, she felt the weight of isolation pressing against her. For the first time since her rise, she truly felt alone, and yet she refused to bend. She had been underestimated before. She had been humiliated before, and she had turned both into stepping stones. She would do it again. Standing at her window, the Lagos skyline stretching before her, Amarachi whispered into the night, her voice low but unwavering. "Obinna thinks he can outplay me. He has no idea who I really am." The words hung in the air like a vow, binding her to the war that lay ahead. Yet beneath the fire of her resolve lingered a haunting question: could this battle cost her everything she had built? For a man like Chikeobi Nwokorie, cracks in his empire were not signs of weakness, they were insults. Each faltering number on his reports, each hesitant business partner, each whisper of Amarachi's name in circles where once only his was spoken, gnawed at his pride like termites devouring wood. He was not a man built to accept decline. He was a man who believed his will alone could bend reality to his favor. And so, when the signs of instability became too glaring to ignore, Chikeobi responded not with caution but with reckless bravado. He began pouring money into failing companies, scooping them up at inflated prices under the guise of rescuing the market. His advisors urged restraint, warning that these acquisitions were dangerous and unsustainable. But Chikeobi silenced them with a glare and a raised hand. "Do you think I became a billionaire by being timid?" he snapped. "This is how power works. You crush weakness before it spreads." The truth was, his arrogance blinded him. What he called strategy was little more than desperation wrapped in pride. His fortune, vast though it was, began slipping through his fingers faster than he could replenish it. But Chikeobi, too consumed by his ego, could not see it. Amarachi, however, saw it clearly. From her office in Ziora capital, she orchestrated quiet maneuvers designed to destabilize his reckless ventures. Contracts that should have closed in his favor collapsed mysteriously at the last moment. Partners who once rushed to align with him suddenly hesitated, choosing instead to court her. On the surface, she appeared uninvolved, always smiling serenely when asked about her ex-husband's decline. But behind the veil of calm, she was pulling threads with surgical precision. Board members within Chikeobi's empire began to notice. They whispered behind closed doors, their confidence in him waning. A few even reached out discreetly to Amarachi, testing the waters, hinting at alliances. For them, it was no longer a question of loyalty, it was survival. They could see where the tide was shifting, and it terrified them. Chikeobi, sensing their hesitation, grew paranoid. He saw betrayal in every glance, treachery in every silence. At meetings, he scrutinized each board member as if daring them to confess their disloyalty. His once commanding presence had soured into suspicion and rage, driving wedges where once there had been unity. The breaking point came when he confronted Kenechukwu Ajaero, the advisor who had once been his most trusted confidant. In the heat of anger, Chikeobi stormed into Kenechukwu's office, his blazer unbuttoned, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. "You," he barked, pointing an accusing finger. "You think I don't know? You've been feeding her. You've been siding with Amarachi against me." Kenechukwu, calm and composed, did not flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "Chikeobi, the truth is simpler than you want to admit. Amarachi listens. You never did. She values people. You only value power. That is why she wins while you falter." The words hit Chikeobi harder than any blow could. His chest tightened, his jaw clenched, but he refused to let the sting show. Instead, he turned on his heel and stormed out, his pride crumbling even as he convinced himself that victory was still within reach. But outside the walls of his empire, the world saw the cracks spreading faster. Rumors of his reckless spending and collapsing deals circulated through social media and financial networks. Once praised as untouchable, Chikeobi's name became synonymous with arrogance spiraling into failure. Journalists who once worshipped him now sharpened their pens, dissecting every misstep. Desperate to restore his image, Chikeobi decided on a gesture of grandeur, a lavish party. He spared no expense, renting an entire island resort, flying in international performers, and inviting dignitaries, celebrities, and business moguls. To him, the spectacle would be proof that he remained relevant, that his wealth still commanded attention. But when the night arrived, the cracks in his reputation showed plainly. Guests who once clamored for his attention arrived late, or not at all. Several prominent figures sent polite regrets, choosing instead to attend a smaller event hosted by Amarachi that same evening. The grand ballroom, though glittering, felt emptier than it should have, the conversations forced, the laughter hollow. Chikeobi noticed. His smile was strained, his laughter louder than necessary, his eyes scanning the room desperately for validation. He raised toasts, gave speeches, but the energy that once electrified crowds was gone. He was no longer the man they adored, he was the man they pitied. As the party wound down, Chikeobi retreated to a quiet corner, the weight of failure pressing heavily on his shoulders. He loosened his blazer, sinking into a chair with a glass of whiskey, when suddenly the large screen in the room flickered to a news broadcast. There she was, Amarachi Nwokorie, dressed in a sleek navy trouser suit, her smile calm and her words precise. She addressed a global conference. The news anchor praised her as the woman who defied arrogance, the strategist reshaping Nigeria's business landscape. Her image filled the screen, her presence commanding even through pixels. Chikeobi stared at her face, the sound of her voice slicing through the hollow noise of his failed celebration. His fists tightened around the glass until it cracked. For the first time, a thought he had refused to entertain crept into his mind. Could it be that the empire he built, brick by brick, was now slipping into her hands? The deeper Amarachi dug into Obinna Akadike's empire, the more unsettling the truths became. Her covert team, led by Chikeobi, worked tirelessly, combing through years of business records, archived contracts, and long-forgotten alliances. What began as a hunt for evidence of financial exploitation soon unraveled into something far more personal and far more dangerous. Hidden within the folds of Obinna's past deals was a connection she had never imagined. Chikeobi entered her office one late evening, carrying a slim file. His face was grave, his voice low. "Amarachi, you need to see this." He laid the file before her and stepped back, as though the weight of the papers themselves demanded distance. Amarachi flipped through the documents, her eyes widening with every page. There were photos, old contracts, letters exchanged years ago. The truth screamed at her in ink and signatures. Obinna Akadike had once been Chikeobi's mentor. Her heart pounded as she read further. It was Obinna who had introduced Chikeobi to his first investors, Obinna who had taught him the ruthless tactics of negotiation, Obinna who had set him on the path to empire. And in return, Chikeobi had idolized him, following his strategies and adopting his arrogance. Their relationship had soured later, but the foundation of Chikeobi's success was unmistakably tied to Obinna. And now, Amarachi realized, she was nothing more than the next piece in Obinna's long-calculated game. He had seen her not as a partner but as a lever, a tool to manipulate the man he once mentored, to exact revenge through her brilliance, and to fold her into his empire when the time was right. Amarachi sank back in her chair, her mind reeling. A sting of betrayal cut through her chest. Not from Obinna, she had expected deception from him, but from herself. How could she, a strategist who prided herself on foresight, have failed to see the threads tying her ex-husband and her new investor together? Ngozi was the first to confront her with raw honesty. That evening, when Amarachi confessed the discovery over a glass of wine, Ngozi's voice was sharp, almost angry. "Amara, you're too smart to let a man play you like this. You saw the signs, you felt the unease, and still, you dismissed it. Why?" Amarachi's lips trembled, though her voice was steady. "Because I wanted to believe I was in control. After Chikeobi, I swore no man would outwit me again. I thought I could use Obinna without being used, but I underestimated him." "Then don't underestimate yourself again," Ngozi countered fiercely. "You're not the woman you were with Chikeobi. Don't let guilt blind you. Use what you know and turn it back on him." The words settled in Amarachi's heart like steel. She would not let Obinna think he had won. The very next morning, She requested a private meeting with him. When she entered his office, he greeted her with his usual polished charm. His blazer was immaculate, his smile disarming, his voice smooth as silk. "Amarachi," he said warmly, extending his hand. "What a pleasant surprise." She ignored the hand, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "I know the truth, Obinna. About you and Chikeobi. About how you built him. And about how you plan to use me against him." For a fraction of a second, his smile faltered, but only for a second. Then it returned. Wider, almost amused. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "And if I did? What difference does it make? You are still winning, are you not? With my support, your empire grows. With my connections, your influence spreads. Why question the hand that feeds you?" His denial was not outright, but his arrogance dripped from every word. Amarachi's jaw tightened, her fury masked by composure. "Because I am not your pawn, Obinna, and I never will be." He chuckled softly, his eyes glinting. "We'll see, Amarachi. We'll see." Meanwhile, across the city, Chikeobi too had stumbled upon the truth. When whispers reached him of Obinna's hidden hand in Amarachi's rise, he felt not only betrayed but humiliated. The man he had once idolized, the mentor he had once trusted, had been playing him all along. Worse still, Amarachi, his ex-wife, the woman he had discarded, was now entangled in the same web. His pride could not bear the thought of them laughing at him behind closed doors. The humiliation drove him to a place he never thought he would reach: desperation. And in that desperation, he did the unthinkable. He reached out to Amarachi. The message arrived discreetly, through one of her aides. It was short, almost pleading. "I need to see you. Alone. Please." Amarachi stared at the note for a long time, her emotions tangled. Triumph surged through her. This was the man who had humiliated her in public, now bending low enough to ask for a meeting. But with the triumph came disgust. His humility was not born of remorse, it was born of need. He wanted her not as a woman, but as a shield against the very man he had once idolized. When she told Ngozi, her friend frowned deeply. Why meet him at all? Let him drown in his pride. But Amarachi shook her head. Because this is bigger than him, and bigger than me. If Obinna thinks he can pit us against each other, I need to know exactly where Chikeobi stands. Later that night, Amarachi stood before her mirror, dressed in a fitted charcoal blazer and trousers. Her reflection was calm, but her eyes burned with something cold and unreadable. She had agreed to meet him, but not as the woman he once discarded. She would meet him as his equal, or his enemy. And as she prepared to face the man who had once defined her past and the shadow of the man threatening her future, the question loomed like a blade suspended in the air. Could this meeting rekindle something or destroy both of them forever? The elevator doors opened to the top floor of Chikeobi's penthouse, but the grandeur that once defined his home had dimmed. The sprawling suite, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lagos, still radiated wealth. Yet something was missing. The energy that had once filled the air of a man at the height of his power was gone. The room felt hollow, like an empire stripped of its glory. The glass tables were bare, the fresh flowers that used to decorate the space absent. Even the silence carried a heaviness, as though the walls themselves remembered the arrogance that had once echoed within them and now mourned its absence. When Amarachi stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble, she found him waiting. Chikeobi stood near the window, blazer wrinkled, tie loosened, his posture heavy. He turned as she entered, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked human. The arrogance that had once been etched into every line of his face had softened. Pride still lingered in his sharp jaw and dark eyes, but it was wounded, fractured. "Amarachi," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual thunder. She did not respond. She simply closed the door behind her and stood, her presence filling the room. Her tailored black blazer framed her tall, poised figure. She didn't need to speak. Her silence spoke louder than words. He shifted under her gaze, uncomfortable. Like a man stripped bare, he ran a hand across his face before finally admitting, "Obinna, he played me. He has always played me." His voice cracked slightly. The admission pulled from a place he had resisted for too long. "He mentored me once. I thought I understood him, thought I could outgrow him, but I was blind. And now, he uses you against me." Still, Amarachi said nothing. She crossed the room slowly, her eyes never leaving his, and sat on one of the sleek leather chairs. Chikeobi remained standing, as though the act of lowering himself before her was too heavy a burden for his pride. I need your help, he said finally, his voice firmer, desperate but still resisting humility. You know him. You see the game. You've outmaneuvered me before, and I'll admit it, you are the only one who can outwit Obinna. Amarachi let out a soft, humorless laugh. Do you hear yourself, Chikeobi? You are asking the woman you humiliated in public, the woman you discarded before the world, to save you. Her voice was steady, but each word cut into him like a blade. Do you remember that night? The gala? The way you looked at me as though I were nothing more than a burden? That memory does not fade easily. For the first time, his eyes dropped to the floor. The weight of shame bent his shoulders, and slowly, almost painfully, he lowered his head. It was a gesture Amarachi had never witnessed from him before. Pride had always been his shield, arrogance his crown. But in that moment, he bowed not out of love, but out of defeat. I was wrong, he whispered, though the words were strained, foreign to his tongue. I let arrogance blind me. Amarachi, I need you. Her silence stretched again, filling the room with tension. She leaned back in her chair, studying him with an intensity that made him squirm. At last, she spoke. If I help you, it will not be as your wife, nor as your partner, nor as the woman you once thought you owned. If I help you, it will be on my terms. I am in control. I make the decisions, and you will follow. His head snapped up, stunned. You want me to? Yes, she interrupted firmly. Submit. If you want my brilliance, my strategy, my strength, then you must bow to it. No arrogance, no pride, not even the illusion of control. I am in charge, Chikeobi, or there is no alliance. For a moment, his pride flared. The muscles in his jaw clenched, his fists tightened, and he looked as though he might erupt into the old version of himself, the man who would laugh at such terms and dismiss her with a wave of his hand. But then he saw her eyes, cold, sharp, unyielding, the same eyes that had stared back at him that night at the gala, but now infused with power he had never truly comprehended, and he realized he had no choice. Slowly, he nodded. Fine, you lead, I will follow. Amarachi rose to her feet, smoothing the crease of her trousers with deliberate grace. Good, she said simply, because Obinna will not be defeated by arrogance. He must be outwitted, dismantled, piece by piece. And if you falter, if you let pride dictate your actions, I will walk away. Do you understand? Yes, he muttered, the word bitter yet unavoidable. She turned toward the door, her stride confident, her presence dominating the penthouse the way it never had when she was his wife. As her hand reached for the handle, his voice broke the silence once more. Amarachi, he whispered, almost pleading. She paused, her back to him. His next words carried a fragility she had never heard before. Don't leave me in the dark again. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. She did not turn back. She did not answer. She simply opened the door and stepped into the hallway, her calm composure masking the storm within her. And as the door clicked shut behind her, the question lingered like smoke in the air. Was Chikeobi truly ready to bow to the woman he once discarded, or was this alliance destined to destroy them both? The alliance between Amarachi and Chikeobi was forged not out of love, nor even trust, but necessity. Both of them knew Obinna Akadike's power stretched far beyond the surface, and alone, neither could bring him down. Amarachi had the foresight, the strategy, and the quiet brilliance to outmaneuver him, while Chikeobi still possessed influence and resources, though they were crumbling. Together, reluctantly, they became a force Obinna could no longer ignore. Their first meetings were tense, conducted in Chikeobi's once grand penthouse, now stripped of its arrogance, but still echoing with history. He sat across from her, blazer pressed but spirit subdued, while Amarachi leaned forward, pen in hand, outlining strategies with a precision that left no room for error. Chikeobi found himself listening more than speaking, a change that unsettled him but also forced him to confront a truth he had long denied. So much of his success had been shaped by her unseen hand. Word of their renewed alliance spread quickly, and it shook the elite circles of Lagos like an earthquake. Investors whispered about what it could mean. Rivals speculated whether Obinna's dominance was truly untouchable. For years, Obinna had built his empire on the assumption that his former protégé and his protégé's discarded wife would never unite against him. Now, the two most dangerous people in his world were sitting on the same side of the table. Obinna's retaliation was swift and merciless. Within days, tabloids splashed Amarachi's face across their front pages, accompanied by scandalous headlines. Old rumors resurfaced, twisted to fit his narrative. Whispers that Amarachi had used her beauty, not her intellect, to climb into boardrooms. Accusations that she had slept her way to influence. Insinuations that her alliance with Chikeobi was nothing more than a rekindled affair driven by desperation. The media storm burned hot, but Amarachi remained unshaken. She appeared on national television, not defensive, but calm and commanding. When a woman rises by her intellect, they call it seduction. When she rises by her vision, they call it luck. When she rises by her resilience, they call it manipulation. But call it what you want, my results speak louder than your rumors. Her voice was steady, her gaze piercing, her presence undeniable. And then, in a masterstroke, she used the very scandal Obinna had unleashed to turn the spotlight on him. Her team released damning evidence of fraudulent dealings buried in Obinna's past companies he had gutted, investors he had deceived, contracts he had manipulated. Headlines flipped overnight. Akadike's empire built on exploitation? From savior to predator. The dark past of Obinna Akadike. Chikeobi, watching the firestorm unfold, could not contain his awe. Sitting beside Amarachi during strategy sessions, he realized with painful clarity how much of his empire had been built on her brilliance, though he had never given her credit. He remembered the late nights when she had quietly worked on his proposals, the foresight she had shared that had saved him from ruin, the strategies she had handed him like gifts he never acknowledged. For the first time, he saw her not as his ex-wife, not as the woman he once humiliated, but as the formidable force she had always been. Investors began to waver in their loyalty to Obinna. Where once his name commanded respect, now it evoked suspicion. Meetings that had once been filled with fawning admiration became quiet interrogations. His power, though vast, was no longer unquestioned. And in that hesitation, Amarachi struck. With Chikeobi's reluctant backing, she executed a bold financial maneuver that left the markets reeling. Through carefully orchestrated partnerships and sudden withdrawals, she collapsed one of Obinna's key subsidiaries overnight. It was a company he had long touted as untouchable, a pillar of his empire. Watching it crumble in the span of hours sent shockwaves across the financial world. Obinna's fury was volcanic. Reports surfaced of him storming out of meetings, his temper once hidden now erupting in public. His calm smile vanished, replaced by open threats. "I will crush her," he vowed in one leaked recording. "I will destroy everything she touches until she crawls back to me, begging for mercy." But Amarachi understood something Obinna did not. Desperation was a weakness. Every threat he made, every reckless move he took, only widened the cracks in his empire. She studied him like a chessboard, anticipating his next strike, positioning her pieces with precision. She knew the war was far from over, but for the first time, she sensed that victory was possible. Still, the war demanded more than strategy, it demanded sacrifice. Amarachi found herself sleeping fewer hours, eating less, consumed entirely by the need to stay 3 steps ahead. Her personal life dissolved into the background, friendships strained under the weight of her obsession. Even Ngozi, her closest ally, warned her gently. "Amara, you're winning, but at what cost? Don't let this fight consume the woman you are." Amarachi heard the words but pressed forward. She could not afford hesitation. Not now. The war of giants was underway, and she had no intention of being crushed beneath Obinna's wrath. Yet as she stood on her balcony one evening, staring at the glittering city lights, the question haunted her like a shadow. Was she truly prepared for the personal sacrifice this war demanded? The war against Obinna consumed Amarachi's days and nights, but it also forced her into closer proximity with Chikeobi than she had ever imagined possible after their bitter separation. Their strategy sessions, once stiff and transactional, began to stretch into long evenings. What started as heated discussions over financial maneuvers and tactical strikes gradually softened into quieter exchanges, where the ghosts of their shared history lingered in the spaces between words. Chikeobi was not the same man who had stood at the gala months ago, dismissing her before the world. The sharp arrogance in his voice had dulled, replaced by something humbler, something raw. In one late-night session, after hours of reviewing contracts and market trends, he leaned back in his chair and studied her across the table. The room was dimly lit, the cityscape glowing through the penthouse windows, casting silver reflections on the glass walls. "I underestimated you, Amarachi," he said quietly, his blazer draped over the back of his chair, his tie long discarded. "Not just as a strategist, not just as a woman of business. I underestimated your worth as a partner, as my partner, and I have lived every day since in regret." Amarachi's breath caught for just a moment, though she masked it with composure. She met his eyes steadily, but inside her heart churned with emotions she thought she had buried. Anger rose first, anger for the humiliation he had subjected her to, for the years she had given that were dismissed in a single cruel night. Then came pride, pride in who she had become, independent of his shadow. But beneath those layers, like a quiet ember refusing to die, was the love she had once felt for him. A love that time and betrayal had scorched, but had not fully destroyed. She responded with cool restraint. "You didn't just underestimate me, Chikeobi. You tried to erase me. Don't mistake regret for redemption." Yet, despite her words, the nights continued, each one drawing them closer. Strategy sessions blurred into shared meals, and shared meals bled into conversations about the past, their struggles, their triumphs, even their laughter. For the first time, Amarachi saw glimpses of the man she had once loved. Not the billionaire cloaked in arrogance, but the young dreamer she had believed in long ago. Chikeobi, for his part, seemed to be changing. The layers of arrogance he had worn like armor began to peel away. He listened when she spoke, not with the dismissive nods of their past, but with true attentiveness. He admitted his mistakes openly, something she would never have imagined from him before. At times, he even allowed himself to laugh, genuine, unguarded laughter that startled Amarachi with its familiarity. But while her heart wrestled with this transformation, Nwokorie remained her anchor of caution. One evening, after Amarachi confided her confusion, Ngozie's response was fierce. "Do not forget who he was, Amara. A man can wear humility when he is desperate, but what happens when the storm passes? Don't let your heart undo the empire you've built with your own hands." Amarachi nodded, but the warning warred with the pull she felt. For every memory of pain, there was a memory of tenderness. For every scar he left, there was a moment of shared triumph they had once celebrated together. The conflict was relentless, consuming her as much as the war with Obinna. The turning point came after a shocking business victory. Together, Amarachi and Chikeobi executed a strike that dismantled one of Obinna's largest contracts. It was a bold move, risky but calculated, and it paid off spectacularly. News outlets erupted with the story, painting the alliance of Amarachi and Chikeobi as a formidable force Obinna could no longer dismiss. That evening, they celebrated not with lavish parties, but with quiet satisfaction in Chikeobi's penthouse. A single bottle of wine was shared between them, the city lights sprawling endlessly beneath their feet. Amarachi allowed herself a rare smile, genuine and unguarded. "We did it," she said softly, raising her glass. Chikeobi's eyes lingered on her, not on the victory, but on the woman before him. The warmth in his gaze was different this time, not arrogance, not possession, but something closer to reverence. As the silence deepened, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "Amarachi." The space between them grew smaller, the tension palpable, their breaths mingling in the stillness. His lips hovered dangerously close to hers, and for a fleeting second, she felt the pull, the magnetic force of history, love, and longing all colliding in one fragile moment. But just before their lips touched, Amarachi pulled back sharply. Her chest rose and fell, her composure cracking as her trembling hands betrayed the storm inside her heart. "No, Chikeobi," she whispered, her voice trembling between strength and weakness. "Do not mistake this alliance for forgiveness. Do not mistake my presence for forgetfulness. You broke me once. That does not vanish." He froze, his expression pained but understanding. He leaned back slowly, his eyes still on her, but he did not push further. Instead, he whispered, "I know, and I will spend whatever time I have left proving I can be more than the man who broke you." Her hands trembled in her lap, unseen beneath the table, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she could no longer ignore. Love, anger, pride, and regret twisted inside her like vines vying for dominance. And as she stood to leave, her heart carried the question that haunted her deepest thoughts. Could love truly survive betrayal, or was it only an illusion born from desperation? The war between Amarachi and Obinna had reached a boiling point, and the man who once smiled with charm now revealed the predator beneath the polished veneer. Obinna Akadike, desperate to reclaim control, launched his most dangerous plan, yet a strike aimed not at Amarachi's company, but at her very reputation. Late one evening, Amarachi received an encrypted message. When she opened the file, her chest tightened. There were sensitive documents, contracts deliberately twisted, financial transfers taken out of context, and private correspondence clipped and edited to paint her as fraudulent. The threat was clear. Obinna intended to release the files publicly, framing her as a manipulator who had built her empire on deceit. The risk was enormous. If the documents were leaked, even her allies might falter. Investors could pull out, the media would feast on the scandal, and her carefully built image as a strategist of integrity would shatter. Amarachi's hands tightened on the desk as she read the final line of the message, "Step aside, or I bury you." When Chikeobi learned of the threat, his reaction stunned her. Instead of rage or arrogance, he approached her with something Amarachi had never truly seen in him before: selflessness. Standing in her office, his blazer open, his voice steady, he said, "Let him release it, Amarachi. I'll take the fall. I'll claim it. It was my doing, my manipulation. Let the world believe I used you. They already think me arrogant, they will believe it. Better me than you." Amarachi froze, staring at him, unable to hide her shock. This was not the Chikeobi she had known. The man who once humiliated her in public now stood willing to sacrifice himself for her protection. For a brief moment, her heart stirred, but she shook her head firmly. "No, Chikeobi, this is not your burden, it is mine. I will not let another man claim my war, whether to destroy me or to save me. I will face Obinna myself." Her voice carried such conviction that even Chikeobi could not argue. He lowered his gaze, humbled, and simply nodded. "Then we face him together." The confrontation came in the form of a high-stakes board meeting, one that gathered Obinna's investors, his partners, and the international press. The room was a polished arena of glass and steel, filled with the hum of whispered speculation. At one end of the long mahogany table sat Obinna, still impeccably dressed, but his smile now stretched too thin, his eyes flashing with fury beneath the surface. At the other end, Amarachi walked in with unshakable poise, her navy blazer sharp against her skin, her gaze unwavering. Chikeobi entered beside her, though he remained silent, his presence a shield. The room stilled as she placed a thick folder on the table and looked directly at Obinna. "You want to play games with documents, Obinna?" Amarachi's voice rang clear, each word deliberate. "Then let us play with the truth." She opened the folder and began presenting her evidence. Years of fraudulent practices, carefully hidden in layers of shell companies and offshore accounts, spilled across the table in undeniable proof. Contracts Obinna had manipulated, funds he had stolen from investors, businesses he had gutted under the guise of mentorship, all laid bare. Every slide she revealed was a nail in the coffin of his empire. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their whispers rising into gasps. One investor stood abruptly. "Is this true, Akadike?" But Obinna's silence was louder than any denial. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched, and his eyes burned into Amarachi with hatred. "Do not let her fool you!" Obinna finally roared, his composure shattering. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice echoing across the room. "This woman is no better than I am. She plays you with her grace, with her calm, but she is as ruthless as any of us." But his fury only condemned him further. The more he lashed out, the more the room recoiled. Investors who once clung to his name now leaned away, their loyalty dissolving. By the time Amarachi laid down her final piece of evidence, an incriminating recording of Obinna coercing a former partner into silence, the decision was sealed. The board turned against him. Murmurs of betrayal became declarations of separation. Contracts were shredded, partnerships dissolved, and the once mighty Obinna Akadike was left stripped of credibility. Security was summoned, and two men in dark suits approached him. As they took him by the arms, Obinna thrashed, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over, Amarachi," he bellowed. "You and your arrogant ex-husband will regret this. I will rebuild, and when I do, I will bury you both." His threats echoed as he was dragged from the room, his empire crumbling before the eyes of the world. When silence returned, all eyes turned to Amarachi. She stood tall, her expression unreadable, her victory undeniable. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, and voices whispered of her triumph. She had faced the predator head-on and dismantled him with truth, not scandal. Yet as she walked out of the boardroom, her steps steady and her head high, her heart felt heavy. Victory had come, but it carried weight. She had destroyed a titan, but she had also sacrificed pieces of herself in the process. Her peace, her trust, even fragments of the love she once knew. She glanced at Chikeobi walking beside her, his presence steady, and wondered what lay ahead. Was this the end of the war, or merely the beginning of a new test that would demand even more from her heart, her power, and her soul? The question lingered in her mind as the cameras followed her into the waiting cars. Was this truly victory, or the beginning of a new test? The fall of Obinna Akadike sent ripples through Nigeria's business world, but the spotlight did not remain on him for long. Almost immediately, the narrative shifted to the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. Amarachi Nwokorie. Her name dominated headlines, her face graced magazine covers, and her composure was dissected on television panels. She had become the living symbol of resilience, an empress who had risen from humiliation to power. But amid the celebration of Amarachi's triumph, one man lingered in the shadows of her success, Chikeobi Nwokorie. For weeks, he watched as her influence solidified, her empire expanded, and her presence grew unshakable. She was everything he had once dismissed, everything he had once taken for granted, and now, everything he realized he had always needed. The truth weighed heavily on him. Without her, his empire had cracked. With her, he had glimpsed victory again. But beyond business, there was something deeper, gnawing at his soul: regret. It was at a high-profile charity gala, held at the same Lagos Grand Marriott, where months earlier he had destroyed her dignity in public, that fate gave him the moment he both feared and longed for. The chandeliers sparkled above a crowd of dignitaries, investors, and celebrities, all eager to see Amarachi, the evening's honored guest. She entered in a fitted ivory trouser suit that shimmered beneath the lights, her hair swept back, her poise radiating the quiet dominance of a queen. Chikeobi was already there, dressed in his signature blazer, though tonight it hung loosely, as though it could no longer carry the weight of his pride. His eyes followed her across the room, every step she took reminding him of the night he had humiliated her in the same hall. The irony was brutal. Back then he had stood above her, basking in his arrogance. Tonight, he felt himself shrinking in her presence. When she finally stood at the podium to speak, the room hushed, her words measured and graceful. She spoke not of her personal victories, but of rebuilding communities, empowering women, and creating opportunities for the next generation. She was not just a businesswoman anymore, she was becoming a movement, and as the audience erupted in applause, Chikeobi's chest tightened. When the applause subsided, he stepped forward. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was heavy with expectation, thick with tension. People turned, cameras lifted, and whispers spread like wildfire. What is he doing? Is he really going to? Chikeobi stopped just a few feet from her, his posture no longer the proud stance of the billionaire everyone once revered. He looked at her, his eyes stripped of arrogance, his voice low but clear enough for all to hear. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I was wrong to treat you as disposable, Amarachi. I was wrong to think my empire was mine alone. I was wrong to believe pride was more valuable than love. And for all of that, I beg not for power, not for partnership, but for forgiveness." The hall seemed to hold its breath. Amarachi stood still, her face unreadable, her silence echoing louder than his confession. Chikeobi swallowed, the weight of her gaze pressing down on him, and then, in an act that stunned every witness in the room, he lowered himself to his knees. The once arrogant billionaire, the man who had humiliated her in this very place, now knelt before her in front of the world. Cameras flashed, gasps rippled through the crowd, and murmurs filled the air. "He's kneeling? Chikeobi Nwokorie is on his knees?" Amarachi's heart ached as the scene unfolded. The image was almost poetic, a reversal of the humiliation she had once endured. But the memory of that night returned sharply. The laughter, the whispers, the humiliation etched into her soul as he discarded her before strangers. Now he knelt, broken, humbled. Part of her wanted to relish the moment, to let him linger in the agony of his downfall. Another part, buried deep, but undeniable, longed to believe him. She turned away at first, her movements deliberate, her silence stretching into eternity. The crowd erupted in hushed speculation. She's walking away. She won't forgive him. This is her final revenge. But then, after several long seconds, Amarachi stopped. Slowly, she turned back, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she approached him again. She leaned down, her expression still unreadable, and whispered words only he could hear. Whatever she said made his eyes close, his breath catching, his shoulders trembling slightly as though the weight of 1,000 regrets had just been lifted or perhaps multiplied. The audience watched in stunned silence, hungry for the truth, desperate to know what her decision had been. But Amarachi gave them nothing. She straightened her back, adjusted her blazer, and turned away, leaving the crowd buzzing in confusion and awe. Her decision was known only to Chikeobi, carried in the whisper that would haunt him forever, whether it was forgiveness, rejection, or something far more complicated. And as the cameras flashed, capturing the image of the billionaire on his knees and the woman who stood above him, one question lingered in every heart. Could forgiveness truly be enough to rebuild what was destroyed, or would it only bring further pain? In the quiet that followed the storm, Amarachi found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. It seemed almost surreal, the memory of standing in the gala hall months ago, frozen beneath the cruel sting of public humiliation, now felt like a distant life. That night, she had been stripped of dignity before the world, her worth dismissed in a single, arrogant sentence by the man she had loved. But tonight, as she stood before the mirror in her penthouse, adjusting the collar of her sharp blazer, she saw no victim staring back at her. She saw a woman who had risen from ashes to build an empire, a woman who had faced betrayal, manipulation, and war, and had emerged stronger than the giants who sought to destroy her. Her journey had not been without cost. Nights of sleepless strategy, days of endless battles, and a heart pulled between resentment and love had left their marks. Yet, Amarachi carried each scar with pride, for they were proof of her resilience. The world had witnessed her fall, but more importantly, they had witnessed her rise. The media now hailed her as both a queen of power and a woman of resilience, the face of modern Nigerian business. The woman who redefined dignity. Her story was no longer tied to Chikeobi's name, it was her own, carved in stone. And yet, as the world celebrated her, her private struggle remained unsolved. What to do with the man who now stood humbled before her? Chikeobi had changed. That much was undeniable. The arrogance that once defined him had cracked under the weight of failure and regret. He no longer approached her with entitlement but with humility, no longer sought to command her but to support her. In late-night conversations, he had spoken words she never thought she would hear. Even if you never forgive me, Amarachi, I will still stand beside you, not to lead, not to own, but to serve. My pride destroyed us once. I will not let it destroy what you have built. The sincerity in his eyes was something she had once longed for, then despised for its absence, and now struggled to believe even as it stood before her. Could a man who had humiliated her so deeply truly be transformed, or was this simply desperation wearing humility as a disguise? The world waited for her answer. Journalists speculated daily, investors whispered nervously, and society's elite leaned forward in suspense. Would Amarachi Nwokorie take back the man who had discarded her, or would she walk away forever, cementing her independence beyond question? The decision came at yet another public event, this time a global economic summit, where Amarachi was invited as keynote speaker. She stood on stage, her sharp navy blazer glinting under the lights, her posture tall and commanding. Chikeobi was there too, seated quietly among the audience, no longer in the spotlight but watching her with eyes full of something the crowd could not decipher. As she delivered her speech, she spoke not of love or betrayal, but of power and dignity. She spoke of women who had been silenced, of dreams sacrificed for loyalty, of resilience born from pain. Her words resonated like thunder, and when she concluded, the applause shook the room. Cameras flashed, capturing her as the symbol she had become, the woman who refused to be broken. Then, as the applause faded, she surprised them all. She turned to where Chikeobi sat, her eyes locking on him, and beckoned him to the stage. The room erupted into murmurs, anticipation sharp as a blade. He rose slowly, walked forward, and stood beside her, not towering over her as he once had, but slightly behind, as though he knew his place was no longer in front. Amarachi took the microphone again. "This man," she began, her voice calm but cutting, "once humiliated me before the world. He treated me as disposable, as though my worth was bound only to his shadow, and for that, he begged for forgiveness." She paused, the silence electrifying, the weight of her words gripping every soul in the room. Chikeobi lowered his head, accepting the truth of her statement. "But today," she continued, "he stands not as the man who broke me, but as the man who learned that power without humility is destruction. And whether I choose to forgive him or not, understand this, my destiny is no longer tied to him. It belongs only to me." The crowd erupted, half in awe, half in confusion. Had she forgiven him? Had she rejected him? Her words were both declaration and riddle, leaving no clear resolution. And that was her genius. If she chose to forgive him, it was on her terms, with full control of their partnership. She would lead, he would follow, and the world would never again confuse her brilliance with his shadow. If she walked away, it would be as a woman who needed no validation, who proved that dignity could rise from the ruins of betrayal. Either path, Amarachi knew, cemented her legacy forever. Chikeobi turned to her, his voice barely audible to anyone but her. "What does this mean, Amarachi?" he asked, desperation flickering in his tone. She leaned slightly toward him, her lips close to his ear, and whispered words only he could hear. His eyes widened, his breath caught, but the audience never learned what she had said. She straightened her back, handed the microphone to the moderator, and walked off the stage, her blazer sharp, her stride unyielding. Cameras flashed wildly, chasing after her, but Amarachi did not flinch. She was untouchable now. The crowd buzzed with questions, speculations spiraling into frenzy. Did she forgive him? Did she reject him? What had she whispered into his ear? The answer remained a secret, locked between the two of them, fueling endless debates. And as Amarachi stepped into the waiting car outside, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, the lingering question remained, echoing through the hearts of everyone who had witnessed her story. Did Amarachi truly forgive him, or did she rise above forgiveness itself? If this story moved you, don't just stop here, share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Amarachi truly forgave Chikeobi, or did she rise beyond forgiveness? Your opinion matters. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more powerful stories, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next journey of resilience, power, and redemption.